Will you be remembered after you're dead? The Z-List Dead List podcast about obscure people from history with me, Izzy Lawrence. What's the best thing that you've ever found? I mean, I imagine there may be some archaeologists here who are just going, well, actually, I found this really nice series of small walls. But you can't impress me with your archaeology because I co-host the Terrible Lizards podcast with Dr. Dave Home, and that man was walking along and he sees a little thing poking out the soil, and what is that? He discovers a tyrannosaur. So I don't think anybody's going to beat that. I put this out on Twitter. I'm at Izzy Lawrence, IZI_LAWRENCE if you're interested. But I put this out on Twitter and one guy said, well, when I wasn't looking for it, I found love. Which is a very sweet thing to do. But I think we've all done that, particularly when we're looking for scissors. I'm being heckled by a cat. Great. That's Vincent in the background, wanting to tell his story of the discovery that his bowl is empty, but it will stay empty for a bit more, because we're familiar with these stories, and sometimes stories of people discovering things that just sounds completely made up. I'm particularly thinking of Alexander Fleming, who famously was doing the washing up, and he noticed in his Petri dish that some mould had eaten away some bacteria, and he was like, oh look, I should investigate this, and lo and behold he discovers penicillin. All I'm saying is he was the head of the department. What head of department is doing washing up? That's all I'm saying. It just doesn't speak of the truth. Far more likely it was a lab assistant, or even maybe a cleaner who's likely female. But I have no evidence to back this up at all, so let's move away from that particular subject and talk about my favourite discovery. Because my favourite discovery, I think in all of history, is my favourite because it just rings so very true. Now think to the last time that you played table tennis. Internationally, this won't work out because internationally people play table tennis presumably in sports centres and funky bars and with kangaroos in Australia. However you do it, you probably have a different culture to that of table tennis in England. Because table tennis in England is known as ping pong or whiff waff because English people who play table tennis are either in youth hostels or they're incredibly posh. In youth hostels they'll be playing it without any bats or ping pong balls because somebody stole them the last time they were there. And in posh houses, and when I say posh houses, I mean a sort of slightly damp older house that at least one wall is Tudor, possibly Georgian, that sort of feeling where they have so many rooms that the one that they tend to call the spider room, which is where they keep the Christmas decorations, the old cupboards, the bits of furniture that don't match, also has a table tennis table in it. And occasionally on a hot summer's day, they put French windows in. You can see the garden. It's perfectly nice. It's just not nice to sit in all the time. The children or the family will go in there and they will have a game of table tennis, which in September 1934 is exactly what happened. We've gone to Chesterfield, one of these very posh houses. I think it's Georgian in this case. And we're going to a man called the Space Cowboy. His name was Maurice Butler Bowden, and he was playing ping pong with some of his friends at his family's Georgian house. And this is what he says. One of us trod on the ping pong ball, and my father went to the cupboard to get out a replacement, and it was soon apparent that he was having difficulty in finding either the ball or a tube of balls. There was, in there, an entirely undisciplined clutter of smallish leather books. So, you got to imagine this cupboard. He goes in there, finds all of these leather books, and the immediate reaction was one of frustration. I'm going to put this whole lot on the bonfire tomorrow, and then we'll be able to find ping-pong balls and bats when we want them. But fortunately, the books were not burnt. And when I say fortunately, it's because one of these books was a long-lost book of history, the Book of Margery Kempe. The existence of this book was known by medievalists at the time because loads of monks had written about her in reference to her, but they got her wrong. They put her down in the books as an anchoress and that she was, this holy mystic lady. But she wasn't an anchoress. An anchoress, by the way, I looked this up. I thought an anchoress was like just basically a type of nun or a mother superior figure, different word for it. No, an anchoress was a woman or a man, could be a man, who was actually walled up inside a religious building. Julian of Norwich is a famous... I know, if you don't know Julian of Norwich, you're going to go, no, she's not, is he? But in Z-list circles, Julian of Norwich, dead famous. She was this very wise lady with getting visions, and she walled herself into St. Julian's Church in Norwich, and people would go and see her and talk to her through the wall and get, advice. Mystic women, happen, St. Bridget, Hildegard of Bingen, they're basically kind of clever ladies, and Jesus would speak to them and they'd be able to impart their knowledge to you. not officially part of the Catholic Church. Some of them were nuns, so they kind of were. There's a sort of weird sort of mix of women in this sort of late medieval time where you have, like, I don't know if we talked about Catherine of Sienna. I remember, I've spoken about her on stage, guys, so really, if you're not keeping up with my live work, you're not trying. Catherine of Sienna is one of these amazing, she was Italian, obviously Sienna, and she was a woman who got her visions of Jesus through starving herself. So in many ways she's anorexic. It's how we'd classify her. But because of her anorexia, she was getting these amazing visions. And she kind of was inspired of being a mystic and being a nun, particularly because her sister, I think, I think she was one of 24 children. So her mum had a lot of births and her sister had died in childbirth. And I think she was about to get married at the age of 14 to a man with a massive head. And I think she just feared it and didn't want it. It was a big motivator of going, actually, I'm going to be married to Jesus. And she did marry Jesus. She went all in. She joined this group of Dominicans. And she basically sort of said, yes, I am going to give everything I have to the poor. But she didn't have anything, so she gave all her family's food to the poor continuously, which wasn't really great. She was all right with it because not eating was giving her visions of Jesus and making her feel special. And everybody else was just like, dude, that was my lunch. And also she said she was married to Jesus. This was a big thing in the church, that you could be a wife of Jesus. But a lot of mystics took it quite literally and said, oh, Jesus is my husband then. And they would do things like they'd have rings. Catherine of Sienna took it really weirdly because she wore a ring that was invisible, but the ring was of Jesus's foreskin, which she'd given her, which is very nice. Have my invisible childish foreskin. It will show how much I love you. Anyway, if you actually read about Catherine of Sienna, brilliant lady, quite intense story. There's lots of art of her looking absolutely gorgeous. There's a really beautiful little picture of her in, I think, the Dulwich Picture Gallery, which is where I stumbled across her. Anyway, that's not the point. We're talking about Margery Kempe. Margery Kempe was not one of these women. She was not a nun. That she was married. She was actually quite a wealthy to do. She came from a, if she would lived in 1934, her family would have had a table tennis room in her house with the Christmas gifts and the old sofa that nobody can sit on anymore that you put the dog in when you got guests round. Margery Kempe would have had that. She was born, they think, about 1373, so sort of late 14th century, and she was daughter of a guy called Mr. Burnham. And if you want to think of him as Mr. Burns, you're talking about that level of sort of wealth. Because they were based in what we call King's Lynn, which if you've been, it's quite a nice place. But it was Bishop's Lynn back then. And then it was much more important than it is now. Because then it's on the east coast of the UK. And it's basically, the Hanseatic League. I don't know if you heard of that. But it's like a big port like London was. So you're getting all the nice fine cloths and that sort of thing. There's a way to make a lot of money. Anyway, when she was about 20, she got married to this guy. And everybody says, every time I see this written down, everybody's going, oh, that's really late to marry at the age of 20, that's really late. It's not actually. Weirdly in Britain, it seems to be, if you're slightly posh, it's usual to wait until it'd be a bit weird if you're 24 and not married, but 20 is fine. I mean, you only get these really young marriages in Europe, particularly in Italy. They're like, oh, you're 13 now, time to get married, otherwise you'll be a spinster. But 20 is fine in the UK. Anyway, she marries this guy, he's called John. Marries this guy, and she has a really difficult pregnancy. Later on, she claims, did not want to get married at all. I really regret it. But it's like one of these really life-changing experiences, this pregnancy. She was obviously sick throughout it. And then when she has the baby, she suffers what modern medical people would call psychosis, what religious people would call an existential crisis, I think. She has really nasty visions, so she's imagining that demons are trying to torture her, starts cutting herself, which to me is amazing, because I thought that was a really quite a modern thing for people to do. But no, all of these things which are really like in the press about anorexia and like self-harm, there were women suffering from this, interpreting it in a very different way. So the psychosis she went through was only quelled. She went on for a year, and she was like, all these demons are trying to get her to kill herself. This is severe trauma she's going through. And not to downplay it, I mean, for her, incredibly real, and she is harming herself, and she is incredibly upset. And then she has a vision. The vision is of Jesus Christ sitting on the end of her bed, wearing purple silk, which is like the most expensive material you can make, by the way, so you know it's Jesus. He's handsome, and he tells her that it's going to be okay. Why have you abandoned me when I haven't abandoned you? And this just chills her down completely, as it would. Son of God sat at the end of your bed telling you to chill out, you're all right, everything's going to be okay. And it chills her out, and everything's going to be okay. I know you're thinking, hang on, Izzy, how do you know all this? Well, we know this because of that book that was found in the ping pong table room. It was the book of Margery Kempe. Marjorie Kempe decided in her late 60s to dictate her entire life story to, I think, well, they reckon it was her son, right? Because she goes on to have 14 births. This thing, in the olden days, they sort of say, oh, I've had 20 children. But of those, how many are stillborn, how many are miscarriages, and how many actually live past the age of 5? And not many is the answer. But her firstborn son is a guy called John. And he, we think, is the one who first tries to do this project with her. She says, I want to tell the story of my life. What by life, she means religious experiences, pretty much, to underline the point that, I know what I'm on about. I've spoken to Jesus. I can see him. He's at the foot of my bed, right? But her son is living in Prussia at this point. All of his, he's trying to write in English and he only knows how to write in German, so all of the letters are a bit wrong. And then she takes it to another priest who sort of goes, oh, it can't be done. And then she takes it to a third priest and goes, oh, okay, let's do it. And she describes all these difficulties in trying to get this book done. But what's really interesting about it is she knows the Bible, like she can quote the New Testament almost perfectly, which suggests that she could probably read. Maybe not perfectly, but she could certainly read the Bible and understand certain words, and she could probably write. And the way I like to think of how people view writing in this time, it isn't like nowadays when you write your book and you sit alone and you tap it away on the keyboard or you write by hand. This is much more of a process. So in order to write, you'd need to speak it out loud and somebody else would need to write it down, and then you'd have a reader also reading it back, and it's a much more collaborative process, the physicality of writing. I remember seeing a thing on QI. I know, look at how well researched I am, a proper historian. But I saw this thing on QI, which these people saying how odd it was that this man could read a book and not utter any words. Because the whole idea of reading something written down was you had to say it out loud. Otherwise it'd be really weird just to read something in your head. How could you possibly understand it unless you actually spoke the words as well? So there's this weird perception we have of writing. And I do sort of think of it more like HTML now. So like if somebody asked you to sort of design yourself a website just using HTML, you could probably do it. You could probably just go on Google, work out what means what, okay, and it'd be a simple, basic-looking website, but you could probably do it, given a day, a bit of HTML, you could get, or you'd do what most people do, was you'd get a scribe in, wouldn't you? You'd get somebody, you'd either use something like Squarespace, or I'm not sponsored by them, by the way, so WordPress, or whatever you like, but you'd either use something like that, or you'd get a friend who was a web designer to do it for you. And I think that's a bit how people imagine book writing to be back then, because remember, this is before the printing press, so everything is copied out by hand anyway, so it's very labour intensive. So you want to have collaboration on these projects, you don't want to do it all yourself. Anyway, she writes down all of her religious experiences, and they are crazy cool. So the weird thing about the book, if you read it, is it's back to front and it's all out of order. So it's literally like having a conversation with me right now where I'm jumping around all over the place. One minute I'm talking about table tennis, another minute I'm talking about Jesus' foreskin, another minute I'm talking about Alexander Fleming. That is what it's like reading this book. It is complicated, it is very tricky, and also the spelling is completely inconsistent throughout. The story is Margery Kempe's life, how she has this mystery sin that she's not confessed to. Personally, I think it was something sexual, because almost everything she talks about is kind of sexual. There's a thing where she's really tempted to sleep with this man, and she's like, she's married, but she's really tempted to sleep with him, and then she's like, no, and he begs her, and she's like, no, and then she thinks, oh, right, and says, oh, would you be interested? And he says, no, you're disgusting, and she's like, oh, I am, which is, pretty weird. She has an issue with her husband that she doesn't want to sleep with him, and she is constantly trying to negotiate ways not to sleep with him, so saying, I'll do this X and Y for you if you promise we don't have to sleep together again, and he's just like, well, maybe, but let's have sex first and then we'll work it out. So she has many children, which she claims this is the thing, she claims in the book, which she has spoken out loud the first time to her own son, saying that she wished she'd never got married and had remained a maiden. So, you're going to think, your son's going to feel great about that statement, isn't he? Poor boy. So she has this big conflict within herself in that she feels drawn to, obviously, religion and the church because Jesus is literally visiting her, and she feels that the only good way to do this is to have lived the nun's life and devoted herself to God, but she can't do that. So what does she do instead? Does she let this stop her? And the answer to that is a big fat no. Margery Kempe travels preaching about God and about love and about all of these things that Julian of Norwich has been doing from inside a walled-up church in Norwich. What? Margery Kempe gets in trouble for this, though, because she is not allowed to go around telling her opinions about the Bible, particularly in the late Middle Ages, because this is post John Wycliffe. And if you don't know John Wycliffe, he's Jean Wycliffe Jean. No, he's not. John Wycliffe, I think he must be dead by the time that she's sort of around, an adult, but he was a guy from Oxford, and he makes Wycliffe's Bible. So he translates the Bible into English. Not a good thing, pro-Catholic. The way the Catholic Church basically has all their power is they have your immortal soul, and the only way to sort of get anywhere with that is to confess your sins to a priest and to have the Bible read to you in Latin and to buy things like privileges so you can maybe have a bit of cake when you're not allowed to. Ooh. And, pray for people in purgatory and all that sort of thing. The Catholic Church has pretty much got all of Europe believing the same sort of thing. And then you have people who can read Latin and they read the Bible and they find out that things like purgatory is not in it and they get all upset. So John Wycliffe is one of the first of these guys. It's kind of like Protestantism. I mean, really, Martin Luther was copying John Wycliffe quite a lot, because there's even a point where John Wycliffe nails his ideas to the Church of St Paul's and says, hey guys, I think the Bible should be in English. I don't think that Holy Communion should be done because that seems a bit like idolatry. Pilgrimages, that thing that Catholic Church makes loads of money out of, idolatry. No purgatory. You don't need to confess your sins to a priest. That's not in the Bible, is it? Very Martin Luther, light, and not 200 years, but just under 200 years pre-Martin Luther. So, and they were known as Lollards. I'm not 100% sure where the term Lollard comes from. There's links to Dutch and German where it got really quite popular. As to why it was called that, because it sounds a bit like muttering, and the idea they used to mutter and go, oh, you can't believe what this priest is telling you, it's not actually in the Bible, do you want to read the Bible, it's in your local language now. But of course this is before the printing press, so nobody's really threatened by that so much, but they are threatened by the idea of challenging the church's authority. And while Margery Kempe isn't a Lollard in the sense of lollardry, she is pretty much challenging the church's authority. She is going around to churches dressed in white, which is like, hey guys, I'm a holy virgin. Isn't that your husband over there? Yes, but I'm not sleeping with him, so it's fine. We've managed an arrangement for me to be chaste, so I don't have to sleep with him, even though she's basically challenging all of the rules. I've got a little extract from her book here, which I'm not sure is going to translate very well over podcast land, because the way it's spelt is so awful. I mean, really, the word archbishop is ERCHEBISCHOPYS. Jesus is spelt IHESU. My favourite one is standing. So, because he left her standing alone, is spelt STONDYN. So not so much standing as stondin. Blue moon, you left me standing alone. This is when she's being examined by the Archbishop of York in 1417. And she's got in trouble. Now, the thing with Marjorie is she travels a lot. She goes all the way, not over the UK. I'll talk about her pilgrimages in a sec, because they are crazy. she is dragged to the chapel to speak to the archbishop by men who are really angry with her. On the next day, she was brought into the archbishop's chapel, and there come many archbishop's men, despising her, calling her Lolla and heretype. It's spelt hair-tyke, excuse me. And sworn, marry a horrible other, that she should be burnt. They're calling her Lolla, they're calling her heretic, and she should be burnt for this crime. And she, through the strength of Jesus, said again to him, Sirs, I dread ye shall be burnt in hell without an end, unless ye amend yow and yow other swearing, for ye kept not the commandments of God. So she's saying, Sirs, I dread that you will be burnt in hell without an end, unless you amend your sayings, for you are not keeping the commandments of God. Then they getten away, as they had been ashamed. So then they left, because they were so ashamed, because she pointed out that they were nasty men. And at last the said archbishop came into the chapel with his clerkies, not his car keys, his clerkies. And sharply he said unto her, Why goest thou in white? Art thou a maiden? And that's the issue. There's another point in the book where a different archbishop, because she gets in trouble quite a lot. And here, I'm sort of making light of it, but she's literally defending herself for her life, because a group of men have brought her to the chapel saying, we need to burn this lady. She could be burnt. Fortunately, she gets away with it, because after the archbishop put to her the articles of our faith, to which God have her grace to answer well and truly and readily, without any great study, so that he mayeth not blame her, that he said to the clerks, She knoweth her faith a well enow. What shall we do with her? So she's able to defend herself and to defend her religious position to the archbishop well enough to save her life. They really try to say, please, can we get her on another way? So they point out St. Paul to her. Or Saint Powell, because he was Welsh in this particular text. And she's answering saying, look, I'm not preaching, because as we know from the Judeo-Paul episode of this podcast, the second Paul is very against women speaking, and particularly preaching. And she says, I preach not, sir. I come in no pulpit, but I use the common saying on, and good wordies, and that will I do, I will leave. So she's saying, hey, you can't get me on that. I'm not going into church claiming to be a priest. I'm just talking to people. I'm just chatting to them. And this is the thing. She had so many friends. People really did believe that she did have some sort of mystical powers and could speak to Jesus. She was a real strong figure and so in command of her faith that she can stand up to all of these guys. I would be scared. These guys can literally burn her alive. The main issue that these men have, one I've mentioned before, the fact that she go around in white. One archbishop was saying, if you're going around in white, what are you going to do? Are you going to join all the other women? Are you going to take away all of their wives and make sure that they don't have sex with their husbands like you aren't, you weirdo? And she's just like, no, I'm just telling it how it is. I'm speaking the truth. And the archbishop asked for, this is brilliant, because this really made me confused when I read it, but how beautiful is this for the etymology? Than a good sad man of the archbishop's men asks his lord what would given him, and he should lead in her. So his sad man is asking, what are you going to give me if I take her away? This is beautiful because it's sad. Why would you want a good sad man? What, so she can't preach at him and make him even sadder? Why do you want a sad man? And it's because if you look at the etymology of the word sad, what it actually means is sober. Sad isn't the opposite of happy, it's the opposite of merry. Sober, merry, miserable, happy. It's beautiful. But the point is, Marjorie stood up to the church, and she was, well paid for it as well. People would give her offerings and everything else, and she'd go stay at them, and apparently she loved to go around people's houses. She gave up meat, though, which is really exciting. So she gave up sex and she gave up meat in order to be chaste. And people just found her fascinating and had her around and offered her money. And she wanted to go on pilgrimage. And at first her husband wouldn't let her, but then her husband said, yeah, go on then. And she went to Jerusalem. This one woman. Nobody at this time travelled alone. But she didn't go with her husband. She took a servant, and she would join groups, very much like Chaucer's time, the Canterbury Tales. That's people going on pilgrimage. This is what she did. But she didn't go to Canterbury. I mean, she was already up in York at this time. She was from Norwich. She went all over the UK. And then, there wasn't a UK at this time, I know. But she, all over England. And then she just went, let's just go to Jerusalem. So she goes to Jerusalem, and it's there. She spends, when I say go to Jerusalem, she can't take a flight out there. She has to spend 14 weeks in Venice and that sort of thing. But when she gets to Jerusalem, she has more visions, and they're really intense, to the point where she nearly falls off her donkey at one point. She's really sort of in there. And at the same time, everybody she's travelling with finds her so annoying. It might be because she's so pious that every time they want to have a bit of fun, she's like, no, you shouldn't do that because Jesus said. Or it might be that she was still in a sort of mild psychosis, and she could, because, she's literally talking about the fact that she can hear Jesus talking to her. So she's obviously talking back with him, and she can hear. So it's like travelling with somebody who's suffering through psychosis. And I don't know if you've seen anybody, anybody like this. Well, this is what she's doing. So no wonder. She gets mocked, her skirt gets cut, so she looks like she's poor, and she looks like she's a loose woman. And they get really upset with her using symbology of, being a virgin, wearing white when she has 14 children. All of this sort of stuff is bothering people, and they mock her for it. And Jesus is saying, that's what they did to me. It's all this suffering. And that is where she gets her ability. It's a sort of weeping ability. I know, it's like the worst superpower ever. But she brings forth tears. And when she comes back to the UK, to England, this becomes really annoying, because in Norwich, where she's based, she's literally going to church 3 times a day, and she's speaking whilst the church is happening, and she's weeping. And people point this out as it being really inappropriate, but church then is not like it is now. They didn't have pews, weirdly, at this time. This was before pews were a thing, because, really Protestantism brought in the whole pews thing, because when the guy is just doing literally the hokey cokey in front of you and swinging the embalments and everything, everybody's standing and chatting and doing their own thing. They might be quiet. They're singing a few bits of song if they know it. They're repeating words they don't understand in Latin. It's not the same. And then they're going up. It's not like it is now. So the fact that she's crying all the time, yes, it's a bit, attention is going on to her, but I don't know how much of a big deal it is in those days as it would be now in a modern church service where everybody's really quiet and it's in English and everybody's having to listen and think carefully. I think it's a bit different. Anyway, so she gets the superpower of weeping, and she still goes on amazing, she's 60 with a broken foot. She gets on a boat because she's following her husband's wife to, I think was it Gdansk? Because she would. And everybody's saying, don't go. And she's going, I'm going to go. And literally, the boat gets blown off course. She ends up in Norway, and she goes around the Baltic a bit, and there's a point in it where she walks 1,000 miles with a broken foot. Admittedly, some of it would have been on cart and everything else, but even on cart, and the whole book is just saying how really hard and horrible it is, and how she's really suffering, and just I know, you silly woman, stay at home. But she was obviously so driven and so utterly bonkers, but in a very cool kind of way. Part of me would not want her in my house if I ever met her, but also the other part of me is like, yes, go girl. You're actually standing up to all of these men. You're talking about what you believe in, and you have this sort of heartwarming story, and you had the precedents to write it all down. And this is the thing, she gets a lot of bad press at the moment, because she does come across as very much the attention seeker, and she's saying how holy she is. And, you have modern writers going, you see, she wants sainthood. That's what she wants. She wants sainthood. That's right. But this isn't the text that you write down if you want sainthood. There are specific texts you need to be able to do to prove sainthood, and it would need to be in Latin. It would need to have certain formatting, and this isn't it at all. This is just a woman going, look at my life. Look at what I've been through. There's something incredibly modern about it and incredibly cool. Yeah, it's also the most useful thing for any historian to have, because not only is this a text which is from a female perspective, OMFG, so rare. And yes, obviously, Julian of Norwich, Hildegard of Bingen, also from female perspectives, but they're very different. They're not living the typical, as in the most common experienced female existence. of being a wife, giving birth, having children. I mean, and the beautiful thing is she goes to see Julian and she speaks to him. They spend, I think, 3 days together chatting, which is just lovely. Julian Norwich, I mean, look her up. She was just so... Obviously, she was an anchoress. There's a word for you to learn. You've learned 2 words today, sad and anchoress. But she was all about, God is love. She was also saying to, look, you know your visions are from God when they're saying love people, and you know they're not from God when they're saying cut yourself and that sort of thing. So, I mean, what a chilled, lovely existence. And the fact that Marjorie made her life deliberately hard so she could experience, it to its fullest. I mean, and she did, people, like I say, were giving her money. She came from a rich background, yet before every pilgrimage, every time she got money, she gave it away. Just simply because she wanted the journey to be hard. She understood that the journey itself was the purpose of the pilgrimage, not getting to the destination, which is just so Instagrammable right now, isn't it? It's just so Instagrammable. It's amazing. But yeah, like I say, she offers this insight into her life, and there's this wonderful extracts of it where she's talking about her husband, because obviously, she's 60 and he's older than her and he gets really ill, and she's talking about taking care of him and the fact that he soils himself and she has to clean it up, and she says, it's really upsetting and annoying, but I'm doing this because I remember, when I loved his body and we had fun together, even though I regret all sex and everything. But you know what I mean? She's a full character in a way that still stumps writers like Stephen King. A female character, who is complicated and I don't think I'd like, but the fact that I can read her book and have that little bit of history, have these women made real and have this life that is similar but so alien is really exciting. And if you haven't heard of her, check her out. So, so that's my take on Margery Kempe and finding cool things thanks to ping pong. You've been listening to the Z-List Deadlist podcast with me, Izzy Lawrence. To find out more, please visit zlistdeadlist.com. To support the show, share this episode with your friends and on social media. You can support me by going to my Ko-Fi account, ko-fi.com/ISZILAWRENCE, I think. Follow me on Facebook, find me on Twitter, and I'll see you soon.